Hi, I'm William Spaniel. Let's learn about international relations. Today's topic is the Iraq War. Could it have been a rational mistake? Today is the perfect time for this lecture because today is the 10-year anniversary of the Iraq invasion. And if you remember back to the last lecture, the big question here, again, is how do covert nuclear programs lead to war? So previously, we figured out that if the declining state can't actually observe whether the rising state is choosing whether to develop a nuclear weapon or not, that means the declining state's going to have to blindly choose whether to proactively prevent or accept a peace, not knowing whether the rising state will build in response to that peace or not build in response to that peace. Now, previously, we had seen a very similar guessing game. This was in the last lecture, where the striker and the goalie in a game of penalty kicks had to act randomly. And the reason for that is that the striker or the goalie, if they choose to go in one direction too frequently, if the striker, for example, decides to kick to the left too frequently, or the goalie decides to dive to the right too frequently, then those strategies can be exploited by the other player. And so to avoid this sort of exploitation, the striker and goalie need to be acting randomly. And the way we knew that this has to happen is by drawing these preference cycles there. So there is a preference cycle between the players among all four of those outcomes there, and there is no stable solution that is going to be able to be predicted in advance. We know that there has to be some sort of randomization based off of those cycle of arrows there. And what we're going to now do is we're going to develop a similar sort of cycle in the context of covert proliferation. So let's start filling in what each of these outcomes represents. And rather than using numbers, I just want to look at what these things are empirically. What do they feel like? What do they look like if we just observe them? Well, if the declining state is choosing peace and the rising state's not building, then we just have the status quo. Nothing's changing, right? There is no power shift, so we just get exactly what's going on today throughout the rest of time. The status quo is maintained. In the top right corner, if the declining state prevents and the rising state's not building, then we have our war payoffs. These are just standard war payoffs. War is costly, so people are going to die, buildings are going to get destroyed, and so forth. But the rising state has nothing doing with nuclear program here because it's not building, so we don't have to pay attention to that there. But in the top left corner, we do, because now the rising state's building. But because the declining state is preventing, the rising state never actually gets to use the nuclear weapons that it's trying to develop. So if that's the case, then if the declining state's preventing and the rising state's building, then we get these war payoffs based off of the fact that the declining state is preventing and launching a war, and the rising state is losing out, it's wasting some costs building these nuclear weapons, which it never actually gets to use. That's important. It's wasting costs here, and we'll see why that's important in just a second. And then finally, in the bottom left-hand corner, the declining state's choosing peace, the rising state's building. That means that the rising state will actually get to enjoy a successful power shift. So it will get the nuclear weapons and it will be able to leverage that power, the power of the nuclear weapons, in the future. All right, let's think about if any of these outcomes are sustainable. Start with the top left-hand corner. War payoffs and wasted costs. Would any one of these parties, the declining state or the rising state, want to change if it knew that this was going to be the outcome that would happen? Well, in fact, the rising state would want to change its choice here. Why is that? Well, it could go from getting its war payoff minus its costs of developing a nuclear weapon, which is never actually getting used, to just getting its war payoff. And so it's saving out on this wasted cost of building a nuclear weapon, which it never actually gets to use. So that means the rising state would want to change the strategy, change the expected outcome, if we were all expecting the declining state to prevent and the rising state to build a nuclear weapon. Well, is this outcome sustainable, where the declining state prevents and the rising state doesn't build? Well, no. Now the declining state is perfectly happy maintaining the peace. Right? Because when the declining state fights a war is inefficient, it's losing out on the costs of war, and so because there are mutually preferable bargains that both sides would prefer to war, then the declining state would be much happier switching its strategy from launching a preventative war to maintaining the peace. It would want to go from its war payoffs to the status quo payoffs, where we are not paying these unnecessary costs of war. Unfortunately, status quo is not sustainable either. Why is that? Well, imagine you're the rising state. You could go from not building a nuclear weapon to building a nuclear weapon, and because the declining state's choosing to act peacefully, you get to enjoy that successful power shift. So yeah, the status quo is nice, but what's even nicer is getting to use that nuclear power to leverage even more concessions out of your opponent. So that means that a rising state here would want to switch things up. And then finally, in the bottom, if there is a successful power shift, the declining state really doesn't like the shift in power. It's trying to avoid these really large concessions it's going to have to give to the rising state in the future. Well, in that case, the declining state would prefer to prevent. And so we see a similar preference cycle here. You can see it's going around in a loop, which means there is no one particular outcome we can expect to happen with certainty. All we know here is that both the declining state and the rising state need to randomize. They need to choose their strategies randomly, so they're not picking a strategy that can be easily exploited by the other guy. It's just like we saw in the soccer penalty kicks. It's the same intuition there, just applied into a far less trivial sort of situation where we're dealing with war and nuclear proliferation. So what does that mean? That means that each of these outcomes is expected to happen. We can't guess exactly which one's going to happen. We can just say one of these is going to happen, and the states are going to act randomly, so we can't actually predict exactly what's going to happen. But there is something important here. We know that this outcome, where the declining state prevents and the rising state doesn't build, will happen with positive probability. Well, what we might call this, instead of just saying this is war payoffs, what we might actually call this is accidental preventive war. Because the declining state's launching a preventative war against the rising state, and yet the rising state isn't actually building weapons in this case. It's just that the declining state doesn't know that ahead of time. If it knew it ahead of time, it would want to not launch preventative war. It would want to have peace. The problem, again, is that the declining state just can't anticipate this ahead of time. Now, we talked earlier, way at the beginning of this course, about the importance of assumptions in crafting theory. So here are two very important premises about the Iraq War. And just think about this for a moment on your own. 1, do you accept that the U.S. should have invaded Iraq if Iraq had a weapons of mass destruction program? And 2, do you accept that the U.S. could not adequately monitor Iraqi activity, especially in relation to its nuclear program? Well, if those two things are true, if you accept both of those facts, then by virtue of that, you're accepting the fact that accidental preventative war is rational. Yeah, it's going to look silly after the fact, because after the fact we realize, in fact, the rising state, Iraq, wasn't actually developing nuclear weapons. But at the time you actually make the decision, you don't actually see that. And if that's the case, you accept the fact that these sorts of mistakes are bound to happen, and it's just the cost of doing business. Now, of course, the first two premises, you might not agree here, especially the second premise here, that do you accept that the U.S. cannot adequately monitor Iraqi activity? In fact, I think a lot of the basis of whether you support the Iraq War in retrospect, whether you or you don't support the war in retrospect, is based off of whether you believe that the Bush administration was actually doing a good job at analyzing intelligence or cherry-picking the particular intelligence it wanted to see to start a war because it had ex ante ahead of time decided that it just wants a war, and a war is the best policy. So I think that's where a lot of the policy disagreement comes into play here. So what's important regardless of that fact, so, we can throw Iraq out of here. Let's not talk about Iraq for a moment. This sort of situation is going to be true regardless of what other country you plug in there. We can plug in any other country. It could be Mozambique, it could be Kenya, it could be Mexico. And if we accept that these two premises hold for each of those countries, then what we are also accepting is that preventive war will be rational against each of those countries. If you don't accept those, if you think that we have good intelligence against a particular country, or that fighting a preventative war against a particular country isn't worth it, then you don't have rational preventative war. But as long as you're accepting these two premises as being true, then you can get rational preventative war and accidental rational preventative war as being legitimate. So that's something interesting to think about, and it's pretty neat now. In 10 years, we have these theories that perhaps explain why you can actually get into a war that looks really, really stupid after the fact. And now 10 years, we are definitely after the fact in terms of the Iraq War. All right, that wraps up this unit on nuclear proliferation. I hope you enjoyed this unit, and we will now go into the final unit in this course, which is also very topical. It's going to be about terrorism and insurgency. So I hope you enjoyed this unit, and I hope to see you next time. Take care.